Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to our event tonight. I want to thank the Center for Responsible Foreign Policy and George for bringing all this together and bringing everybody here. Tonight we're going to hear from a very interesting speaker who's going to talk to us about the influence of foreign governments in U.S. policy and U.S. academia and U.S. think tanks. And Ben Freeman of the Center for International Policy is the foremost researcher of this topic. He has explored all of the connections. He has looked at he has tracked all of the things that people don't want you to track. He has annoyed all of the people who don't want you to know who's funding them. And we see where some of this foreign funding and some of this foreign influence can even lead the United States to go to war or keep us in wars as foreign governments want the United States military power to continue to keep them in power. So without further ado, Ben, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you to the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy for having me here once again. Thanks, as always, to George O'Neill, and thank you all for coming. I invited all of the think tanks mentioned in my report, but they're not here, unfortunately. They're busy getting foreign donations. No, I kid.
But seriously.
But seriously. And especially thank you to Shauna for inviting me back at this time. And I was actually reminded that it was a year ago, that this month, I believe, I just saw the 2019 year in review, that it was a year ago that I came here and I talked about this very iceberg. And so I thought it very fitting to return to the iceberg. When we last talked a year ago, I was talking about the iceberg of foreign influence in America. And I was pointing out that what we see is largely above the iceberg, not just the pretty penguin. But we see the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which has kind of become a household term. Everybody knows FARA. It was made famous by Paul Manafort and others. Russia Today, being considered a propaganda outlet, being required to register under FARA. And if you've been paying very close attention, you might even have read this, our report on the Saudi lobby and what they're up to in America. And also since a year ago, we put out another report on the United Arab Emirates lobby last November. And next month, if you're still paying attention to all these countries, we're sort of hitting the other side of the Gulf spat and putting out a report on the Qatar lobby in the U.S. We're going to come back to Qatar here. But what we didn't discuss last time was as much what's below the iceberg. One of the issues that I highlighted was foreign funding in academia, but another big one that we didn't dive into all that much was foreign funding at think tanks. In the year since I talked to you guys, that's taken up an irrational amount of my time. And we recently put out a report on foreign funding of think tanks. Now, you might have heard about this issue a few years ago when the New York Times put out this piece. Foreign powers buy influence at think tanks. And then they, of course, highlighted the Brookings Institution and the significant amounts of money that they see. But one thing you'll note from this report right here, 2014, many, many years ago, number one. The lead author of this, Eric Lipton, and I were on a panel with our friends at the Center for Responsive Politics. They were launching a new FARA tool. And before the panel started, I brought this piece up to Eric. This was way back in 2017. And I said, Eric, that was great, but I think we need we need an update of that. That was only in 2014. You know, there's a lot of foreign influence going on since then. And Eric was basically like, Ben, that's way too much work. Why don't you do it? Me being the idiot that I am, said, "Oh, okay, I'll go. I'll go right ahead and update this great analysis." I think it took about 2 months into doing the analysis where I was like, "Eric's right. This was like an absolute fool's errand. I'm an idiot for even trying to tackle this." And the reason I say that is because it's actually very hard to follow the money going to think tanks, particularly the foreign money. In many cases, think tanks don't want you to know this information, and most importantly, above all, they're not required to disclose this information. So it can be, pulling water from a stone in some cases to get this. And so what we did was we started with the think tank's tax filings. This is a 990. If any of you have ever had the displeasure to put one of these together or to look one over, I'm sorry. Life will get better. We unfortunately spent a lot of time looking at these 990s, and you notice a few things about them. You can get a sense of who the contributors are there. That column C, you can see some big money here going to. This is for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is one of the biggest foreign policy think tanks that we have in town. CSIS has some big top end donors. And you can see the amounts. You can see that that's a person. These top three, they're all people. But you'll notice in column B that has the name, address, and the zip code, except it doesn't have the name, the address, and zip code because these are not required to be disclosed in IRS tax forms. And that's true whether it's a domestic donor or whether it's a foreign donor. So CSIS doesn't have to disclose any of this in its tax filings. But what happens in many cases is you get information that comes out like this, where a Gulf government makes a secret $20 million donation to a DC think tank. You get an intrepid journalist who will dig up something like this. So what we then asked is, if we're going to investigate this, if we're going to try and dig this up, why should we care? And there's a few reasons I think folks should care. Number one, David and I were talking earlier about think tanks and why they should matter. And I always think back to when I go home and talk to my friends and family in Florida about what I do for a living. And inevitably, when I tell somebody I work for a think tank, one of my joking friends will say, "Wait, they pay you to think?" Doesn't seem right. And I say, yeah, they pay me to think. They actually pay a lot of people to think. And it's actually this whole industry of thinking. And what a lot of people don't know about think tanks is, in many cases, think tanks are literally writing our laws. Folks at think tanks are working hand in hand with policymakers. They're literally writing laws. They're writing hearing questions. They're writing talking points for members of Congress. And the example that I highlight in the report is the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation sort of famously, really came into its own during the Reagan administration, where, according to Heritage Counting, they submitted over 1,000 pages worth of recommendations to the Reagan administration, and the Reagan administration actually did over half of those recommendations. Now you can, take the Heritage Foundation scoring with a grain of salt if you want. They are scoring themselves, but they were undoubtedly incredibly influential there. And what we found in our own research is this first bullet point, that they're working hand in hand with the registered foreign agents for many of these countries that are also funding them. We found this specifically in our UAE report. We found that UAE lobbyists, UAE PR folks were working directly with some of these think tanks that are also funded by the UAE. So they're working hand in hand there. And what we also found many instances of, think tanks are getting direct access for their diplomats. And for example, UAE Ambassador Otaiba, he speaks many times at think tanks that the UAE is also funding. Now, would they host him for a talk if he wasn't funding them? Well, maybe, but it probably makes it a little more likely. And what we found too with the post-Khashoggi response was that think tanks can also, they can just have influence by saying nothing after a big event happens. And a lot of the think tanks that sort of sat on the sidelines after Jamal Khashoggi's murder, they were either funded by the Saudis or the Emiratis. Our friends at POGO, the Project on Government Oversight, have done a very good report, and I would encourage folks to take a look at this too, because this is another important form of influence. Folks at think tanks often testify before Congress. They testify before the House and the Senate, and many times they're testifying before the Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Armed Services committees, and they're testifying about issues relevant to specific countries. What they're usually not telling those members of Congress is that their salaries are at least partially paid by some of those exact same countries that they're testifying about. POGO has identified many cases where think tank experts are going to testify about the very countries that are funding them, and the members of Congress they're testifying before have absolutely no idea about what's going on. So what did we do? We started with what think tanks themselves told us. And this is an annual report for Brookings. And so we started the painstaking task of seeing what was already out there. We looked through those IRS forms. We looked through think tanks' annual reports. Anything they had publicly available, we scooped it all up and aggregated all that information into what quickly became a rather monster-sized database. Then we went to the journalists. We said, okay, if they didn't publicly reveal this information, some folks in the media have done some great work at this, particularly The Intercept. Folks like Ryan Grimm there have done some great work exposing funding going to think tanks that those think tanks didn't publicly disclose themselves. So then we took all that, we roped all that in. And then I went old-fashioned. I made some calls to all these think tanks and tried to fill in the gaps that we had. It might surprise you to think, like, when Ben Freeman, a guy who heads a program called the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative, calls you up and says, "Hi, can I have all your foreign donors, please?" You might think, I just get a lot of clicks, and I did. Frankly, most people just either didn't take the call or didn't respond to the email. But in a lot of cases, we did get some responses from think tanks. And frankly, kind of one of the interesting things that we found was that a lot of think tanks didn't even realize that this was an issue, or didn't realize that they weren't or they weren't at the height of transparency on this. And so they sort of saw the writing on the wall and, kind of wanted to get to a higher level. For example, we had conversations with the Belfer Center at Harvard, and I couldn't find any of this information for them. And then had a great email exchange with some folks there, and they've subsequently put all this information online and made it publicly available. So we had a good transparency win there, too. Oh, one thing I'd like to point out, I love using this Brookings annual report because Brookings has one of my favorite categories of donors, which is the $2 million and above category, which even looking at all these other think tanks, there's just like this extraordinarily large category. And it's also noteworthy because every year in our analysis, the Embassy of the State of Qatar was one of these $2 million and above donors to Brookings. And we'll come back to them in a minute. So what did we find? Foreign money at think tanks. With that methodology, and we were only looking at the top 50 think tanks in America. There's over 1,800 think tanks in America now, so we couldn't possibly look at everybody. So we looked at the top 50, according to the University of Pennsylvania, and we looked at them from 2014 to 2018 to kind of keep that New York Times study going. We found at least $174 million in funding. The biggest recipients were the World Resources Institute, Center for Global Development, Brookings, Atlantic Council, and the Aspen Institute. And you can see all of these in that infographic that I handed out to everybody. You can sort of see how big this web gets, this influence paradigm. And the backstory on that infographic is we actually started that thinking that, we'll list all the think tanks that we have and all their foreign donors. And then it became like this nasty rat's nest of things, and it became just way too unwieldy. And as you can see, even with the top 5, it's extraordinary. And a few things to say about each of these. David and I were talking earlier about the World Resources Institute and the Center for Global Development. They do a lot of work in foreign countries, and so a lot of the countries where they're doing their work, they're also being paid by those governments there, and so that sort of makes sense. It's not for the work they're necessarily doing here in the U.S. But as you know, Brookings, the Atlantic Council, and Aspen, a big chunk of their work is done right here in the U.S., and they're still getting a lot of money from foreign donors. In fact, the Atlantic Council was interesting for us because they had the title of having the most different foreign governments. They had more than 24 different foreign governments that have donated to the Atlantic Council. In the report, we list our top recipients and what each of them have received, too. And you sort of see, it's kind of a who's who of DC foreign policy think tanks with a bunch of money coming into each of them. In the World Resources Institute, as you can see, these sort of the big 3, these top ones, had the vast majority of the funding that we identified coming in. Another way to look at this that we broke it down was who are the foreign donors. we identified 74 different foreign countries and institutions. And so we had 66, I believe it was, different foreign countries. We had 8 different institutions. This included a bunch of the development banks around the world, the United Nations. The EU is also a donor to think tanks here too. So whenever you're thinking, you see a report from a think tank about the European Reassurance Initiative or any of those things, there could be some funding coming from the EU to support that European Reassurance Initiative. So a lot of these issues tie back to our issues of war and peace. And the biggest donors that we found were Norway, the United Kingdom. They were very close, 1 and 2. And then number 3 is the United Arab Emirates. And the UAE jumped out to us for a variety of reasons. And we of course, list all of them in our report. And what you can say, there's a few different takeaways that you might have from this. And one that really jumped out to us right off the bat was a lot of the countries listed here, they're democracies. A lot of the countries listed here, they're our allies, with some notable exceptions. And starting with the UAE up there at number 3, in the Qataris too, we're a huge donor to Brookings, in a few other places. Also France in there, Morocco there as well. But otherwise, mostly democracies, with those exceptions. And mostly the vast chunk of funding was coming from our Western European allies, and so it sort of led us to a couple different conclusions. I think the report has been misreported in some cases. That not all foreign funding isn't necessarily nefarious. We're not making the argument that the treacherous Norwegian lobby is going to take over U.S. foreign policy. If they did, we might all be riding bikes and swimming in rivers. But in many other cases, the UAE, which we dove into pretty heavily, we identified some cases where it looked like there was explicitly pay-for-play work going on behalf of the UAE. One instance, for example, was with the Center for a New American Security, which was a very prominent national security-focused think tank. There was a contract between CNAS and the UAE ambassador to the U.S., Otaiba. Otaiba paid CNAS $250,000 for a report on which would effectively have argued for militarized U.S. drones to be sold to the UAE. What could go wrong? UAE is doing so well in Yemen, right? CNAS agreed to do the study. Otaiba paid CNAS $250,000 for the study. It was ultimately a version of it was ultimately made public, and it recommended exactly what the UAE wanted, which was for the opportunity to buy U.S. military drones to use in its operations in Yemen and elsewhere. And this gets us to our report here. Sort of another way to think about this, and another way to think about that infographic, and I should explain on the infographic there. The width of the lines gives you a sense of the scale of the funding. So the bigger the line, the bigger the source of funding. And so thinking at these, you could see a few different patterns. The World Resources Institute, the Center for Global Development, because those are the biggest recipients. You're going to see some bigger lines going to them. But the interesting thing, I think, are, here with Brookings, Qatar being a huge recipient to them, Brookings really spreads out its funding across a lot of different countries. So does the Atlantic Council, too. And so there's a question of, how much of a particular think tank's funding comes from these foreign governments, and, how much does that matter? For example, I'm thinking of the Center for International Policy. If we had that, $2 million plus grant from Qatar every year, that would fund most of our operations for the entire year. So it'd be big for us. But Brookings, I believe, their operating budget in a year is over $100 million. And so for Brookings, it may not have the exact same impact. This chart is really what we were trying to drive home in the report, though, and this is where we sort of call out the good, the bad, and the ugly from our analysis. And so, sort of going from red to the green here, these are the levels of transparency that we were able to group different think tanks in. And basically, what we found was a few different patterns. Number one, if you're in red here, this is sort of the bad guys. These are the folks who didn't publicly disclose their foreign funders. And even when, I made those really polite phone calls and, sent those, they were really nice emails, guys. They still didn't respond to me, still didn't disclose that information. And so we really don't know who their foreign funders are there. Going all the way over here to this side, in green are think tanks who either publicly state on their website that they don't accept funding from foreign governments, or who I talked to explicitly and they said that was their policy to not accept money from foreign governments. In between here, there's this sort of interesting amalgamation of folks, and the sort of most common categories or the levels of disclosure that we found are these yellow and blue categories. And initially, most of these think tanks here, they fell into this category of they would list their the foreign governments that were giving them money, but that's it. You would just see that, say, Norway or the UAE was giving money to one of these places, but you wouldn't have any sense of how much. The next level up from that is this blue category here, and that's where folks like the Aspen Institute and the Atlantic Council fall into, where they'll tell you which foreign governments are giving them money, and they'll give you a range. This is also where Brookings falls into, where you get that $2 million and above range. And it's good. It's more information, so we can sort of get some sense of scale. But the problem, especially for a numbers nerd like me, is where the heck are you in that scale? And so that's why in everything I've told you and everything we write in the report, we report our numbers as at least X amount of money, because we don't know how much above $2 million the Qataris give to Brookings. We don't know exactly where in these ranges each of these foreign governments fall in terms of funding for these think tanks. For the Center for Global Development in the Chicago Council, they take it to the next step, and they tell you exactly which foreign governments are giving them money and exactly how much money they're getting from those foreign governments. The Chicago Council, and it really jumped out to us as being, remarkably transparent. And the Chicago Council especially, I'll give them kudos on this. Because they disclosed down to literally, we had a donation that we tracked for $100 from the Canadian Embassy to the Chicago Council. And I remember when we found it, we're like, what can you buy in DC for $100? Like, you can't get a hotel room in DC for $100. Maybe an Uber to and from the airport. But they reported it, and so, fully transparent there. And the lesson for us about both of them, too, the Center for Global Development is one of the biggest think tanks in the world. Chicago Council is not too shabby either. These are big places, and they're fully transparent. All the information for them was very easy for us to find. And so it sets a valuable precedent and provides a valuable lesson. You can be an influential think tank that takes foreign government funding, and you can be fully transparent about it. Like these, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. Just because you take a lot of foreign government funding doesn't mean you have to hide it from folks. And as I mentioned, the green category here, these are folks who said they don't accept funding from foreign governments. And there are folks here like the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, and AI specifically. I talked to somebody there, and they said it's their policy not to accept funding from foreign governments. One question that we've sort of had with the rollout of this is, well, what if they accept money from somebody here who got money from a foreign government there? And my answer is, I don't know. And that to me is sort of the frustrating part of this is, we only know what we found in our analysis. We don't know how they circumvent these protocols. We know it happens sometimes. That's, again, why we say, when we talk about the money, we say at least X amount of funding here. And there's some other interesting hybrids in here, like some of these asterisks here provide additional information. The interesting thing, and I'll say in terms of sort of the feedback we've gotten from a lot of folks, the fascinating thing about this chart is that I've heard a lot of from a lot of different folks at think tanks will say that are mentioned here, and a lot of what I've heard from folks that work at these think tanks is they had no idea that their think tank was being funded by some of the foreign governments that we list in the report. And my response was, of course, like, but you work there, don't you know who's paying the bills? They're like, absolutely not. Multiple different think tanks had no idea. And so then to me, I'm like, well, man, if you don't know who's paying the light bill at your place, then certainly the readers of your reports are going to have no idea what's going on there. So that to me was a little bit troubling. Number two, I've talked to folks at some of these think tanks too, and these are finance HR people at two of these think tanks. I won't name them, but they shot me, kind of snotty emails that said, "Hey, in your report, you mentioned that we take money from, all these different foreign governments. We have no record of taking money from some of these folks, specifically these three countries." And then I just read the email and I'm smiling because I'm pretty good at doing my research, so I can go right into my database and I pulled up their publicly available filings where they listed that they do in fact get money from these countries. And so I, in a very nice email, I'm nice in my emails, guys, I swear, you should email with me more. In a polite email back to them, I say, okay, we were just relying on public records, and here's the links to the three sources that we had for that information. And this was somebody who was in HR, worked in finance at one of these places, and they didn't know about some of these foreign funders. So the message to me really about the analysis was that there's a lack of transparency even within a lot of think tanks about foreign funding of those very think tanks. And so if nothing else, we need to get this information out there so employees at think tanks can have a better idea of exactly who's paying their salary. And that sort of brings me to my point, and I apologize for those who are not used to Prezi, that I'll get you dizzy if we start spinning around this iceberg some more. But our ultimate goal with this report, as with a lot of our work, is to flip the iceberg upside down, to flip it on its head. And to say, we want to take all that information that's below the iceberg. We want to take everything that's invisible there, and we want to get that up top. We want to solve this problem, and we want to increase transparency. Fortunately, there's a very simple solution in this case. We have to require think tanks to disclose their foreign funders. As I mentioned, this report was a year in the making. This was a lot of work. And for your average consumer of think tank information at home, think tank experts are on CNN, Fox News, NPR, pretty much anywhere you're consuming foreign policy news, there's a think tank expert being quoted there sometime that day. And the readers have no idea that the country that expert is talking about just might be funding their work. They have no idea about those conflicts of interest. We need to get all that information up and out there. There's a simple fix on that IRS tax code. Just have the IRS require that foreign donor information to be made publicly available. You can keep that domestic donor information. You can keep that in the IRS vault. But at least when it comes to foreign donors, funding think tanks that are explicitly talking about foreign policy and working to change our foreign policy, the least we can do is let folks know when a foreign government is paying for that work. And then we flip the iceberg right back upside. That is all my presentation. I thank you as always for having me, and I welcome any questions you might have. I believe George's hand was up first.
Now, I have a question. I find it hard to believe that Saudi Arabia gave so little amounts of money. Is it possible that you were tracking government, but not the various princes that were giving money?
I was keeping an eye on the princes too. It's a great question, and if I do this report again, I might just focus on foreign policy focused think tanks. The reason Saudi Arabia is not highly focused in there, Saudi Arabia gives a lot of money to think tanks. They give a lot of money to think tanks, but many of those think tanks are outside the top 50 think tanks we looked at. So we only looked. We took the University of Pennsylvania does this study every year where they rank think tanks. So they rank all 1,800 think tanks in America. So we said, all right, we can't look at all 1,800. We'll just look at their top 50. And outside of that list includes places like the Middle East Institute, the Arab Gulf States Institute, and other explicitly Middle East focused think think tanks where we know the Saudis give a lot of money, and when a lot of these Saudi princes give a lot of money, but they just fell out of our purview. And that was honestly, it was one of my, it sort of made me sad as somebody who's been quite critical of the Saudis for a couple of years now.
I have a question, yeah. These people go to Congress all the time, they testify and all that. Is there any kind of regulations or anything that they can do to say, like, okay, here's John Smith, and he's from the Atlantic, and they are sponsored or they've received money from, because we know this happens on TV with journalism all the time as well. And if the viewer or the people that are going to these hearings knew, then they certainly would, take a little different path towards, oh yeah, I should believe in this and it's all good. So is there anything out there that you guys are working on for that front? Because Congress, they'll bring anybody in. It doesn't seem like they do a lot of research on it. So it seems like that might be another place to start.
Yeah. It's another solution too. That it's I steal from Pogo, and so it's not a Ben Freeman original. That's why I didn't put it on the slide. But it's about what they call truth and testimony forums in Congress, and it's the weird, arcane, ineffective system. So only in the House, when you testify before the House, you have to file what they call a truth and testimony form. And so you have to list a bunch of information, but amongst them are any potential conflicts of interest, basically. What Pogo found in their analysis of these forms, the one I mentioned of them, foreign influence at the witness table, they looked at all of these for prominent think tanks on foreign policy type hearings. And what they found was most of the time folks weren't listing any conflicts of interest, even though Pogo had done the good work of finding like, hey, you're from a think tank that's funded by this very country that you're talking about. They wouldn't list it there. And the other problem with the truth and testimony is there's no real punishment for violating it. And so you can just, if you're testifying and you don't actually want to reveal that your salary is paid for by the Saudis or the Emiratis or somebody else, you can kind of do so with impunity. There's no real punishments in the truth and testimony, and I think there should be. I think some basic punishments, like at least to say if you do that, you're barred from testifying again for a certain time period, or perhaps life, because you're. To me, you're lying to Congress by not disclosing that information. And so, I think a lifetime ban on future testimonies would be warranted to me. And another basic solution, too, is that's just in the House. The Senate has nothing. There's no truth and testimony forum in the Senate. And so for folks testifying before our Senate, you don't even need to lie. The Senate's not even asking. Which is just ridiculous to me. So at the very least, we need to have those truth and testimony forums in both the House and the Senate, and we need to have some meaningful punishment for violating it. So some meaningful enforcement there. That's a great question.
That'd be a great op-ed too, to circulate on the Hill.
Oh, okay, I'll write it.
It should be, well, when you look at everything going on in the grand scheme of things, these foreign influences are influencing this country and staying in war in the Middle East and that nature.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see if congressmen and senators actually knew that this was something that they should stay away from or that needs to be disclosed.
Yeah.
Because, they could just have no idea about it, and maybe when they are oriented, they have their freshman orientation, maybe that ought to be a question or something talked about when they go in, because I would imagine a lot of these congressmen have no idea.
Yeah.
Just happy to have the support for their wars.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I should have talked about it more here. But the number of times we identify some of these in the report where there's a huge overlap here in this report in our general research with the forever wars, and what you see are these folks that are being funded by some of these countries that benefit from U.S. involvement in the Middle East and other places. And it's not just the Middle East, too. We see a lot of funding going to these think tanks from our allies in Asia, for example, Japan and South Korea. were donors too, and who benefit from U.S. military bases in those countries. And so, keeping the U.S. on an advanced footing. And then you read the reports coming out from the think tanks that are funding them, and what do they encourage? More U.S. military bases in these very countries that are funding them. And so for some of these foreign governments, it just seems like they're making a kind of a conscious investment in these think tank reports to keep coming out and keep encouraging the DC blob to be more in favor of a more militarized U.S. foreign policy in a more aggressive U.S. posture all over the world. Three questions. This is a low crowd. We need more beer. Or maybe you want to get to the beer. Maybe I have that backwards.
I'll ask another. Is it possible some of these things are funded by self-interested oligarchs who are close to these governments?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there any way of tracking that kind of thing?
Yeah, and this sort of gets to the there is and there isn't. Like in so many of these cases, we were conscious that we didn't want to punish people for their disclosure, because we think there's a lot of folks out there who are not disclosing anything, who wouldn't respond to those emails and those phone calls. And I think what you're seeing, particularly from some of these bad regimes, and like you mentioned earlier, George, some of the royal family in Saudi Arabia, funneling donations into places through ways that we just can't track. And I put up one of the Brookings annual report, but that was just one of them for 1 year that we looked at. We read every single line, every single person that was in an annual report. We looked up everybody, and we did sort of mini background investigations on every single individual donor listed in the reports. And so that's what we know, but what we don't know, I think, is what you're getting to about, if that person that was mentioned there, who we found, might be a U.S. citizen, might be somebody, that we wouldn't be concerned about, might actually, effectively be, just a conduit for a foreign government trying to get that money into a think tank here. And I think and that's really what worried me. And David and I were talking about this earlier. What worries me about this is not what we tracked here. It's what we didn't track, like what we couldn't find. Because I think the truly bad actors and the truly, frankly, shady folks at think tanks who are really doing the pay-for-play type work, we'll pay you X amount of money to say these explicit things that we want to say, they're just not reporting it right now. And under the current law, they don't have to. They don't disclose that information, and we're just left in the dark.
So the Saudis could also overpay for certain hardware.
Yeah, and we know from some of the Saudi arms sales too and not just Saudi, UAE too. They have I'm blanking on the term for them, but when there's an arms sale, the kickback. Is this ringing any bell? Where they have to give like X amount of money, back here to different U.S. firms and basically donate a certain portion of it. Some of that money has made its way to different think tanks here. In fact, that secret $20 million contribution that I brought up there, that was an article from The Intercept that was about money from the UAE going to the Middle East Institute, and it was basically it was almost like a rounding error off of one of these arms sales.
Well, it's buying congressional support, so some congressmen probably won't say anything about it because all of that stuff has to go through Congress, and they're supposed to look at it, and that's why I would imagine if they're funneling money that way, that's the reason for it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, you maybe go through and track votes or track, when the report goes over we need to sell Saudi Arabia 16 refueling planes, even though they're a tiny country. That maybe when it goes to Congress and they're supposed to approve it, in the committees or whatnot, maybe look at that and figure out who is approving and who's raising hand going, what does Saudi Arabia need 16 refueling planes for, type of thing. And that could also kind of maybe,
Sounds like something Ron Paul would say. Yes, Kurt.
Something just to keep in mind that I was surprised to discover years ago, and it's still true today. Raytheon, for instance, which has its headquarters historically up in the Boston area in Massachusetts, was explained to me that all of the non-recurring engineering on all missiles and radars connected to theater ballistic missile defense, or theater air and missile defense, all of that is paid for by the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. That's an enormous chunk of change. Non-recurring engineering, that means what you invest in order to build the missile initially. It doesn't involve subsequent investments to build more missiles. The point
Right.
is that this is the hard stuff that pays thousands of technicians, scientists, and engineers. So whenever you talk about anything that impinges on Gulf security, there's always someone standing in the background that whispers into the ear of the people on the Senate Armed Services Committee, House Armed Services Committee, or in the White House. Look, these people have made it possible for us to build all of these systems, and we're the leaders in the world.
Right.
And that gives you pause about the wisdom of saying, well, look, why are we bothering in the Gulf? What's wrong with this? Why? We don't depend on Gulf oil anymore. You hear that all the time.
Yeah.
Yet nothing changes. Well, that's one of the reasons that nothing changes. And that's the sort of thing that I think George was talking about, are we paying more for the hardware than perhaps it would normally cost?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the.
Yeah, or they say they keep the cost down for Americans, so the American military gets a
Right.
bit of a discount. But
They'll overpay.
yeah.
And then, of course,
And
the
they pay tax.
delegation from Massachusetts is keenly interested in all of this.
Right. Because it's jobs.
Everybody has their hands in the sort of national treasury in some fashion.
Yes, and they're very happy to have these wars to create the need for these missiles. If we didn't monkey around over there, we wouldn't need all those missiles,
Yeah.
defending our troops who are over there.
For sure. David, did you?
Can you say a little bit about the foreign money going into the hospitals you were talking about?
Oh yeah, it's sort of tangential, but this is man. I feel like I've tried to expose the iceberg, and now I'm just like expanding the underneath part of the iceberg. But we're looking at a few of the other areas that we talked about before that are still under the iceberg. Foreign funding in academia, for example. A lot of good folks in Congress have kept an eye on Confucius Institutes on campus. We want to expand that analysis. We want to look at everybody. So we're hoping to do some of that work later this year to track all that foreign money going to all U.S. universities, so we can see who the big players there are. And also, I think I've mentioned this to some of you, but China is actually not the biggest player on U.S. universities by far. The biggest player is Qatar. Far and away, 3 times as much money coming from Qatar to American universities as Chinese funding to American universities. So, issues to talk about there. And then another part, sort of under the iceberg here of influence, and certainly not as nefarious as maybe a foreign government's lobbyist, but a big part of foreign influence operations for foreign governments now is charitable giving. And they're giving to hospitals from my great state of Florida, David and George's great state of Florida. They give a lot of money for hurricane relief to different whenever a county in Florida gets ravaged by hurricanes. Collier County, for example, got over $1 million from the Emiratis a couple years ago when the hurricanes came through there. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's just a way to, sort of garner goodwill. And in some cases, with some of the hospitals, their big donations made to hospitals are some of the belief is that it's to get access to their families to have top-notch medical care at those hospitals.
And I'm interested to see how this money, if it goes into local groups, like police organizations, you hear about the Saudi officials who assault and kill women in America, and they get a straight direct flight. I guess it's they get a direct flight back to Saudi Arabia, just like the bin Laden family got after 9/11. So it's just interesting to see if there's any money going into these local governments even to be able to basically buy off every aspect of every piece of America that they need for their convenience. It seems.
Yeah, David's trying to get me arrested by a local sheriff. I'm fine with it. Yes,
Yeah, but the drug cartels actually do use that. They provide services in Mexico and Central America to the poor people, and they give kids bicycles for Christmas to buy that goodwill. And that's that they've become intertwined and you can't recognize the government because the narcos are in that. So it's not, I mean, that's nothing new. It's something they use to make sure that people in the communities are saying, hey, no, it's okay, you killed like 16 people last week. We're cool with that because I got a bike for my kid.
Yeah.
They do that. Countries do that.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Sadly, Mexico does.
Yeah. Do you have questions?
Yeah, thank you. I think the bias of think tanks are partly because of American foundation. For example, AEI received a total of $1 million in funding from Charles Koch Foundation in 10 years. So do you analyze the internal foundation for think tanks?
No, we haven't looked at domestic funding. I mean, sort of the bias of my program is that, you know, we're the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative, so we haven't looked at that as much. I am interested in doing a follow-up project to this on U.S. government funding of think tanks and specifically U.S. military funding of different think tanks. And I just... I hate to keep picking on Brookings. I actually play softball for the Brookings softball team, and so this is it's a double-edged sword for me. I bat cleanup, so I bring in runs for him, so I feel like I can beat him over the head a little bit publicly. But Brookings always has a military fellow from each of the services that are working at Brookings, and they're paid for by each of the military services. They can provide valuable insights and everything, but you know they're going to have the bias to their service. So I very much want to do a follow-up to this report on U.S. military funding of think tanks and also defense contractor funding of think tanks to sort of get to Colonel McGregor's point on this of, you know, Raytheon's a big funder of think tanks, Lockheed Martin, all the big defense contractors. They're also some of the top funders of think tanks here, specifically foreign policy-focused think tanks. You know, if you go to an event at CSIS, you know, it's been Defense Budget Week, and for budget, I'm also a budget nerd, and so with that coming out, you're seeing all these events at different think tanks. They're always sponsored by Lockheed Martin. They're sponsored by the defense contractors. They're sponsored by Northrop Grumman. They're sponsored by the very people that benefit the most from the defense budget. So not surprisingly, when you go to these events, what do they say about the defense budget? It's good. Make it more, make it higher. And then a pesky nerd like me, you know, raises his hand and says, we're already near historically high levels of defense spending. Shh, you know, pipe down, we need more money. So I guess this is sort of a roundabout answer to your question where I'm definitely going to tackle some of the domestic funding, but only as it pertains to, you know, sort of issues of war and peace and the forever wars.
Well, and also I'll add something to that because if you look at Politico, you look at Defense One News, at the top of their daily newsletters, and, you know, I get all of these brought to you by Raytheon, brought to you by Boeing. I mean, all these different defense contractors are doing that. So do you think Politico is going to write a super negative story about Raytheon?
Right.
So I mean, when you look at them, that means for most people that would mean that that's not a journalistic entity any longer.
Yeah.
So.
I'll tell you, I published a piece on Sunday with Bill Hartung that would encourage you to read about the defense budget. We published it in Defense One, and we were talking about the defense budget being too high. And every time, Bill has very good connections with Defense One, but every time he says, well, I think we should publish it in Defense One. And I'm like, you think they'll take it? I'm like, I don't know. But they did publish it, and I think we made Politico's Morning Defense or one of the other ones too. But you're exactly right. It's like they when this comes in your inbox, you know, it says brought to you by Raytheon, and then it's, you know, my piece in there is just like, hey, maybe we're spending too much money. But the first thing that gets in your head when you're reading that is just like, hey, but the new stealth bomber, right?
Yeah.
You know, like, let's drop tens of billions of dollars on that, and then you may not even get to reading my piece.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I brought it up to the National Press Club as well. I'm like, so where do we stand on these kind of issues? And they don't want to talk about it either.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we're hurting for money, and we'll take it from anyone. I'm like,
yeah, and I'm not paying them anything,
Yeah.
so. I'm way over time, you guys. I apologize for that. I'm happy to stay around and answer any other questions, but if folks got to go, I want to respect people's time. Thank you very much once again for having me. As always, thank you.